Welcome to lecture 4, the second lecture for today. Um, the specific title is From Susan Sontag to Eve Sedgwick. Let me share the PowerPoint for this lecture. And now you should be able to see it, correct?
Yes, ma'am, we can see.
Great. Thank you. So, lecture 4 is entitled, as I said, From Susan Sontag to Eve Sedgwick. That's the subtitle, actually, because the title is Falling. And in fact, this is the word the enigma that the entire lecture will try and explain, illustrate, resolve. Let me begin, however, by why falling? Why the act of falling? We just spoke about the kinesthetic dimension of Arendt's speaker who wishes to step into, to cross the threshold toward language and therefore toward qualified life. Now we're talking about falling, the action of descending. Why? This is the question I will raise and try to answer. Now, first, let's recap what we achieved in lecture 3. So, with Arendt, we have encountered a subject before the threshold of language, poised before a threshold, the threshold of language. We have looked at the importance of exiting naked life and finding a shelter, this asylum, in a common public sphere of language and action. And we have looked at the concept of the space of appearance. That is the space where we are heard and seen by others. The world as an immaterial, thick set of relations within which we exist. Now, in this lecture, I propose to move on to two speakers. Two authors, two American thinkers and writers, Susan Sontag and Eve Sedgwick. And moving from one to the other will allow us to paint the picture of the evolution of critical thought in our time, in our days. My aim is, first of all, in the lecture will be, first of all, to highlight the motif of descending, which we have already encountered in HD and Alien Rage, you will remember. But here in this lecture, descending will be taken on as a metaphor for critical practice. We'll look at two key figures who, for whom critical practice amounts to a kind of descending, and we shall see why. Now, let's begin with Susan Sontag. Some of you may have heard of her. She, born in 1933, she has been, for a long time, a cultural icon in the US and an icon of the US abroad. But we are interested here in Sontag as a thinker. And in this drawing that you see on the slide, the first point I would like to make when speaking about Sontag as a thinker is that with Sontag, the boundary between critical practice and thinking thins. It's critical practice, but then there is thinking. It borders on thinking, and thinking borders on the life of the mind. The life of the mind, in other words, contains contains within it critical practice and thinking. They are both part of the same life of the mind. Vital to the life of the mind, vital to the life of the mind is the pursuit of illumination. Okay, the pursuit of illumination, the pursuit of an idea of truth. This is what we normally associate with the life of the mind, the pursuit of an idea, the pursuit of illumination, the pursuit of truth. Traditionally, the pursuit of an idea, an illumination, the pursuit of truth, traditionally has been associated with an ascent toward light, hence illumination, an ascent, a going up, a movement upward toward light, toward truth. With Sontag, the pursuit of an idea, the pursuit of illumination is a descending, the main metaphor for the life of the mind. Whether it be thinking or critical practice, remember the boundary things, is a descending, a falling down, a movement downward. A descending, a going down. So, in lieu of the assertion of an I think, there is a conscious ego, master of the capacity to be insofar as he thinks, we have a weaker kind. Remember, our overall title for the two lectures is Weaker Subjectivity, a weaker kind of I think, not an egoic self-enclosed monad. Not an egoic, self-enclosed monad. In fact, Sontag is very eloquent about this weaker, I think, in her notebooks, where it is possible to track the motif of the descent. Her notebooks are finally out. They've been published. When I did my research on Sontag at UCLA, they are not yet been published. And I referred to my book on Sontag, where if you're interested, you can find a discussion of the quotes from the notebooks, not as referred to the published material, but with references to other unpublished materials. But Sontag's son, David Reef, has done a wonderful job of publishing the notebooks, and I'm very grateful to David Reef for his work, because he has made the notebooks accessible, and they are a valuable instrument in teaching and in lecturing, just as we're doing today. But so Sontag is very eloquent in her notebooks. In the summer of 1976, the motif of descending, can in an entry from 76, the motif of descending is towers, is a central concern. And she wonders, in that entry, she wonders about Plato's allegory of the cave. We're going to read part of the entry in a second. Let me first preview what she argues in that entry. She argues that, Sontag argues that having an idea is not, as in Plato's parable of the cave that we're going to look at as well, is not ascending in and toward an undefined space of light. Having an idea, she argues, is not going up, but going down. It's a kind of descending. And she calls it a voluntary, so chosen confinement. So she inverts Plato's idea, or the classic idea of the life of the mind, of truth, the pursuit of truth, therefore, of the life of the mind. Let's look at least in part, at that entry. So from her notebooks. But here the metaphor, so she's been talking about Plato and about the parable of the cave in Republic. And she pauses and wonders. But here, that is in Plato, the metaphor of the cave, of ascending out of the cave toward light, isn't just. Just is a telling word. It's not, she doesn't say isn't right, isn't just, it's not fitting. And it does not do justice to the life of the mind. Having an idea is more like going into a cave than it is like emerging from one. More like a voluntary, in parentheses, but the parenthesis only highlights the word confinement further, more like a voluntary confinement than a standing in open, undefined space. Now, you may begin to sense a difference with Arendt. You've just heard about Arendt, the individual stepping into, crossing that threshold and stepping into language. Therefore, the visual image implied in the crossing is someone standing erect in an open space. Well, here, Sontag is saying something different, more like a going down than a going up. If you go down here, the implication here is a loss of mastery. We had loss of mastery in Arendt, but by comparison, that was very light. Here we have a really weak, I think, really weak thinking subject. Just a reminder about Plato's allegory of the cave in Republic, in Book 7, where in a dialogue between Socrates and Glaucon, they speak about, Socrates speaks about the life of the mind. I'm going to read only a few passages. There are 2 slides, but I think it would be important to recall the parable so that we can see how Sontag inverts it. And now allow me to, Socrates speaks, and now allow me to draw a comparison in order to understand the effect of learning, or the lack thereof, upon our nature. The effect of learning, so the life of the mind. Imagine pursuit of knowledge. Imagine that there are people living in a cave deep underground. The cavern has a mouth that opens to the light above, and a passage exists from this all the way down to the people. They have lived here from infancy with their legs and necks bound in chains. So they are attached to the cave, part and parcel of the cave. They cannot move. All they can do is stare directly forward, in front of them, as the chains stop them from turning their heads around. Imagine that far above and behind them blazes a great fire. Between this fire and the captives, a low partition, a kind of screen, therefore, is erected along a path. Something like puppeteers used to conceal themselves during their shows. So imagine there is a screen, and they are looking at the screen behind which shadows move. Glaucon, I can picture it, and Socrates continues. Look, and you will also see other people carrying objects back and forth along the partition, things of every kind, images of people and animals. So you can see that these enchained beings look at the screen, but what they see is images of people and animals. The dialogue continues, and we get to the point. Socrates speaks, look again and think about what would happen if they were released from these chains and these misconceptions, because they are looking at images, not the real thing. Imagine one of them is set free from his shackles. What would happen? Now, let's say that he is forcibly dragged up the steep climb out of the cavern and firmly held until finally he stands in the light of the sun. The ascension toward the light. don't you think that he would be agitated or even begin to complain? Under that light, would his eyes not be nearly blinded, unable to discern any of those things that we ourselves call real? The prisoner, used to living in chains in the dark cave, knowing on the shadows, would surely be blinded, would surely refuse the benefit of the light. Glaucon, no, he wouldn't, follows, just as we're doing. And finally, Socrates says it would take time, I suppose, for him, for the prisoner who has been freed into the upper levels, into the light, it would take time for him to get used to seeing higher things. So the nugget of truth contained by the parable is that by and by, of course, the thinker, the prisoner here, a metaphor for the thinker, by and by degrees, gradually gains the ability of detecting higher things, higher truth. So the path to truth is a path upward, gradual, but upward, up a steep path upward. This is what the classic account of the life of the mind is. Sontag rereads it, goes to Plato's. She had, after all, a philosophical formation. Sontag studied as a philosopher, and then she went on to become a literary critic like Benjamin. She embodied the thinker for whom the divide between philosophy and literature is very, very thin. So Sontag goes back, revisits the classic site of the life of the mind and inverts the terms, inverts the images. She talks about the situational thinking. In Plato, the situational thinking. Plato is not describing completely the situational thinking she feels. She inverts the allegory of the cave and argues that having an idea, as you read in the notebook entry, having an idea is more like going down than going up. It's not an upward path, an ascent, but more like a downward fall, a descent. With this image, with the image of descending, Sontag develops, this is, you can keep track of this in the notebook. Sontag develops the wish, the desire to write a different kind of essay. She's animated by the desire to write a different kind of essay that is neither historical nor cultural criticism, but a philosophical essay. So she's looking for a new form for the discourse of philosophy. A wish to think in words but differently, because what is an essay? What is an essay after all, if not thinking in words? So she's searching for a way whereby thought and words are not separate, but are you think insofar as you speak, you use on paper, you use words. So she is charging language with an important task. But this idea of not distinguishing thought from words, that is to say, gaining consciousness that philosophy is not just abstract thought, it is also about language. And an awareness that of the role of writing, of the role of words in the way philosophers express or craft their thoughts is needed. This idea comes from Adorno. You've heard the name Adorno, okay? The critical theorist, we mentioned him while talking during lecture one, we're talking about Butler. So the wish for a different kind of essay, different form. In the notebooks, we can follow Sontag along the path of this fall. There's a progressive, as you read the entries, there's a progressive sliding motion that resembles a graceful fall. We talked about the graceful turn, now the graceful fall, which in a way is a kind of indocility vis-a-vis the classic Plato. So in a notebook entry for 1980, at the time, Sontag was already an acclaimed public personality. She was an established thinker. She was admired for being experimental, eclectic. She embodied the best that America had to offer. And yet, in this entry, this is what you read. If there is a unifying theme of my work, it is naive. The theme of moral seriousness, of passionateness, a mood, a tone. She's saying if there is no system in my thought, there's a resistance, in fact, to system. If I think of my thought, I think about moral seriousness, passionateness, a mood, a tone. No, it's more a virtue. Remember the word virtue. Foucault had called critique of virtue. Same here. She's aiming for a thinness, a lightness, a grace of thought that almost resembles a mood, a tone, but it's certainly not mastery, not system. And you can see her actively turning away, almost methodically turning away from system, from the solipsistic ego, I think, turning away toward a weaker, graceful, thinking I. In the same entry, she's in flight from thinking reduced to a demagogic activity. To further illustrate this turn toward a weaker, I think, the same entry. I must give up writing essays because that inevitably becomes a demagogic activity. Demagogic. What demagogy is the administration idea, the forceful, ugly imposition of ideas that must be thought. I seem to be the bearer of certainties that I don't possess. I'm not near to possessing, countering the master, the subject is master, the master of thoughts. I'm not possessing. So explicitly, deploying the metaphor of property or possession. Certainties I do not possess. So the life of the mind, as she's reclaiming a certain freedom and a certain experimentality that alone are associated with the possibility of truth or pursuing the truth. And what I find striking is the candor. She's talking to herself, but those who write notebooks, keep notebooks, are always already aware that they are going to be read by posterity. There's that hope. So yes, she's talking to herself, but she's talking to us as well, making us see with candor her rejection of ugly demagogy. That's why she talked about moral seriousness earlier on. Thought is more about rejecting staying away, steering clear from demagogy and certainties that are imposed rather than, this, rather than constructing something or pointing to something. It's more a countering, a gentle countering. We are back, certainly, we are back in to critique, because critique is about giving ourselves, remember, the right to not to be governed so much. And she's claiming that right here. Now, this may be absolutely probably clear to you because we have followed lecture 1, but I wish to emphasize that Sontag has not been seen as a thinker, and certainly has not been seen as the thinker she deserves to be seen as, and she has certainly not been seen as a major mover in the movement of theory, that movement that has changed the face and the practice of criticism, because it has, as a consequence, it has meant what I'm doing here. I'm working at the intersection of different, different disciplines, or importing in literary studies ideas from other disciplines in the hope of finding out how texts of literature is useful, about the uses of literature in the world. So as she is one of the major movers of critique, even though she never claimed any affiliation. In fact, she did not like to be labeled, but her notebooks are fascinating because, among other things, they contain pages of intimate conversation and dialogue with her contemporaries, with Foucault, with Jacques Lacan, with other thinkers. And it's really a fascinating dimension of the notebooks. Those of you who are interested, I talk about that in my book on Sontag, the English book. Then the Italian book is more an introduction of Sontag to the Italian public. So what about, let's look closely at some of her works. We have tracked her idea of thinking of the life of the mind as a descending, as a fall in the notebooks. Let's look at the work she has become popular for, celebrated for, against interpretation. Here it is, against interpretation more than as a title, is used as a motto, because in fact against interpretation is the title of one of her earlier essays, the one that and the title also of a book that gave her instant celebrity. But against interpretation became a motto describing a certain critical position. This is the book Against Interpretation, and the lead essay is also the essay that gives the book its title. 1966. This is an image of the cover of the first edition. What is the uniqueness of this collection of essays? Well, the main trait of Sontag's work, of early work, but it will be the main trait, it will continue to be the main trait of her other work, later work, is in the fact that she interweaves philosophical discourse with literary discourse. So again, crossing the boundaries of literary and philosophy. What is the objective of this book? Well, the objective is this collection of essays, and certainly of the objective of the title essay. It's a call for an ampler scope for the critical act. Sontag specifically targets the critical act and the task of the critic. She proposes what she calls a critical theory, not criticism. Remember, we have looked at this problem with Benjamin, 1923, okay, when Benjamin advocated a larger, a more nuanced practice of criticism called critique. Sontag talks about critical theory. There is a criticism that is no longer limited to the exegesis of individual texts, to assessing their value, to judging them, to establishing how they compare to others, but a criticism that reaches to, and I quote her here, to a substratum of hidden thoughts and feelings. A criticism that is, yes, rooted in texts, but a way of thinking with literature, thinking with literature whereby literature becomes almost a torch to light up the substratum of hidden thoughts and feelings. Those thoughts, those feelings, those principles that underpin, though they are invisible, they underpin not only our society, but the texts that come from our societies. In other words, the symbolic uh, um, underpinnings. So that's what it means, thinking with literature. And the fact that Sontag is talking about thinking with literature is already a novelty, not thinking about, thinking with. So let's look at the essay Against Interpretation. Against Interpretation rejects judgment as the main feature of literary and art criticism, challenges the assumption that a work of art can be reduced to a message, something to take away, or that the text can be summed up, or a work of art can be summed up in a message, and rejects, against interpretation does not mean that she rejects interpretation. On the contrary, interpretation, the activity of interpretation is reclaimed, but on different grounds. That is, she rejects aggressive theories of interpretation. Quote, the modern style of interpretation excavates. When she talks of modern style, she talks also about the style that she had inherited from in the US from the new criticism. The modern style of interpretation excavates, and as it excavates, destroys. The modern style is intent on finding a subtext, which is the true one, but in the process of finding that subtext, it destroys. What does it destroy? Well, the potentiality of form itself. The modern style of interpretation, the implication is here, does not pay enough attention to form. Remember that Benjamin said truth is intimately, though inconspicuously, interwoven with the material aspects of the text. Sontag is reclaiming that position, following up, and redefining the task of the critic. So, how can the critic welcome the problem that this is important? The problem that brings on the necessity for this redefinition of the task of the critic is precisely mass culture, and at the time, the assumed divide between high and low, between elite and the people. Sontag is interested in knocking down the wall that separates elite from the rest, from popular culture, elitist culture from popular, high culture from popular culture. And the task of the critic is modulated by this need, this exigency. Let me allow me to read from Against Interpretation from between pages 13 and 14. Think of the sheer multiplicational works of art available to every one of us, superadded to the conflicting tastes and odors and sights of the urban environment that bombard our senses. Ours is a culture based on excess, on overproduction. The result is a steady loss of sharpness in our sensory experience. All the conditions of modern life, its material plenitude, its sheer crowdedness, conjoin to dull our sensory faculties. And it is in the light of the condition of our senses, our capacities, rather than those of another age, that the task of the critic must be assessed. We must see more. A critic must be able to see more, feel more, sense more. Now, so you see that the redefinition of the task is linked to the necessity of taking stock of our position in capitalism. So literature is plugged into the world. Remember Raymond Williams. For reasons of time, I'm going to skip. Uh, we can talk about it in the tutorial. The beginning of Notes on Camp. In the beginning of that popular essay called Notes on Camp, she reiterates, the task of the critic, but from a very personal perspective. It's really engaging. But perhaps we can precisely start the tutorial with that. Just checking time. I don't want to marginalize or ignore Sedgwick, so I'm going to uh, conclude with Sontag temporarily and move to Sedgwick. So there is in Sontag what emerges in our discussion of criticism is the dichotomy surface versus depth that she's interested in erasing, in debunking, in dismantling. And in fact, she does so with a motto. The last fragment notes of Against Interpretation says, in place of a hermeneutics of art, we need, so in place of depth, we need an erotics of art, sensibility to form, superficial form, or the material contents. Now, Eve Sedgwick, from to what does Eve Sedgwick have to contribute? I mean, having spoken about Sontag really helps, paves the way. Sedgwick is known as one of the founders of queer theory. I want to begin with a later work, with A Dialogue on Love, an extraordinary text, where she recasts the critic, following up on everything that we have said when speaking about Sontag. She recasts the critic as thinker, knower, seeker. In other words, there are no boundaries. Remember what we said about the life of the mind: criticism and thinking, no boundaries. Always in the process of distancing herself or himself from a sort of ontological impoverishment. She recasts the critic as thinker, knower, seeker in a hostile environment, having to manage to orient himself herself in a hostile environment, using literature to orient himself herself in a hostile environment, but also using literature to repair, to heal the hostility coming from the environment. I want to read an extraordinary passage from A Dialogue on Love. Again, we can talk about that during the tutorial. It's a matter of suddenly, globally knowing. Here, Sedgwick, in A Dialogue of Love, is brooding on, reflecting on her critical practice. Remember, she's the author of Epistemology of the Closet. Right after Epistemology of the Closet, she discovered she had cancer. And so she had to wake up to the reality of the mortality of the body. She's a critic here, speaking from the awareness of being also a mortal body, a mortal someone. It's a matter of suddenly, globally knowing that another person represents your only access to some vitally transmissible truth or radiantly heightened mode of perception. And that if you lose the thread of that intimacy, both your soul and your whole world might subsist forever in some desert like state of ontological impoverishment. We have no time to talk about the formal sophistication here. Sedgwick begins by writing in prose. She embeds a haiku in her prose, Japanese haiku in her prose, to utter something that would be too difficult to utter in prose, and then she returns to prose. She conceptualizes ontological impoverishment. The quote encapsulates the theoretical achievement of a dialogue on love, where drawing on a type of Japanese haiku, which combines poetry and prose using an essential simple language, Sedgwick articulates not just the condition of the critic, but a generalized condition. Here, the impoverishment at the beginning, there is an impoverishment at the beginning. And the critic starts with that. The critic that Sontag is, that Sedgwick is, starts with that impoverishment at the beginning, but it's no longer this impoverishment. Remember, is the feminist perspective, the perspective of minorities, where this impoverishment is typical of the position of the disadvantaged. Here, Sedgwick disperses, scatters, extends that impoverishment at the beginning, which is no longer the hallmark of marginality or difference or discrimination because of difference, gender, sexual, racial, layers, but extends to everyone. It's the human condition. It is an ontological poverty marking the human condition. This theoretical achievement is the point of arrival of a career-long process. We have no time to track that process, but we can certainly point to one of her most celebrated and her most influential essays as an important landmark in that process. Paranoid reading and reparative reading. 2003. This is an essay where Sedgwick reflects back on her critical practice. She had practiced the hermeneutics of suspicion. Remember the Barthes-Derrida axis, okay? She had practiced the, remember Foucault's critique, the slight turn, the gentle indocility is also, contains in itself also an attitude of suspicion. She had practiced the hermeneutics of suspicion, so she had been looking in what in text had been repressed by the earlier criticism. That's how she could, institute queer theory, the epistemology of the closet being a landmark work in that. But she renames the hermeneutics of suspicion paranoid reading. She draws on psychoanalyst Melanie Klein, and that's where she takes her terminology. The point that matters for us is that she argues that it would be wrong to condemn and reject critique as practice in terms of hermeneutics of suspicion, in terms of paranoid reading. That is, critique that says no and that is intent on revealing relations of power, masking relations of power, dismantling relations of power. It would be wrong to reject critique practiced in that way, intended as such. But what is desirable is to imagine critique as a movement in two phases, in two stages. There is first, the paranoid part, whereby you're focused on knowing what is repressed. But this part would not be effective, would be negative and damaging, probably, if not accompanied by another impulse, another movement, which she calls the reparative impulse. So the hermeneutics of suspicion, the critique that we have encountered in Foucault, in Butler, is meaningful when it comes to Sedgwick only if it is supplemented by a reparative impulse. This is how she describes, the reparative impulse, the reparative motive. just checking time. Yes, we have 4 minutes. It is not only allow me to read. It is not only important but possible to find ways of attending to such reparative motives and positionalities. The vocabulary for articulating any reader's reparative motive toward a text or a culture has long been so sappy, aestheticizing, defensive, anti-intellectual, or reactionary. Remember, that's why we went to Rich, that's why we went to H.D., because they were able, in those poems we chose, to suggest a reparative motive, a reparative impulse, while not being sappy, aestheticizing, defensive, anti-intellectual, etc., etc. The prohibitive problem, however, has been in the limitations of present theoretical vocabularies rather than in the reparative motive itself. Our vocabulary, the vocabulary of critique, is limited, she's saying. No less acute than a paranoid position, no less realistic, no less attached to a project of survival, and neither less nor more delusional or phantasmatic, the reparative reading position undertakes a different range of affects, ambitions, and risks. In other words, the reparative impulse, reparative motive is no less effective, important, and desirable than the kind of critique that dismantles power. It's equally desirable. Why? What we can best learn from such practices, reparative practices, are perhaps the many ways cells and communities succeed in extracting sustenance from the objects of a culture, even of a culture whose allowed desire has often been not to sustain them. She's saying that a reparative motive is a way of turning toward a use of texts, a use of text. So to legitimize a use of text, to find sustenance, for the self of the reader, the self of the critic. What we have to imagine is a critical act, but more than a critical act, a critic who goes to literature in the attempt to orient himself or herself in a hostile environment, in an environment that is felt as hostile. A critic who is bent on a care of the self, where care of the self is not an aestheticizing or solipsistic thing. A care of the self in the sense of a reparation, a preparing the self, putting literature to this use. Retelling interpretation, retelling the text, okay, not for its message, but for the kind of sustenance that can be extracted from objects of culture, texts being objects of culture. In other words, Sedgwick invites us to reflect on the motives of reading and on the motives of criticism. What might a criticism be that extracts sustenance from the objects of culture? The question is what to do. What do texts do? Not what they are. So what to do with them? It's not what they are. Or rather, how to do things with texts. And perhaps we can recap before moving to the tutorial. So, in conclusion, what have we talked about in these two lectures? Well, especially in the last lecture from Sontag to Sedgwick, we have identified the search for a different critical practice. Sontag has expressed this search with her refusal to be dogmatic or fear of being dogmatic. wanting to see more, hearing more, feeling more. So the need for a critic who does this, sees more, hears more, feels more. Sedgwick responds, to this need for a different critical practice with a reparative reader, theorizing a reparative reading, who reassembles the text and gives himself or herself the right to reassemble the text without being accused of using and abusing the text in ways that offer nurture in inimical cultural surroundings. So the reparative reading is someone, as Sedgwick puts it, who helps himself, help himself, help himself heal. I cannot see the screen because I am. Let me helps himself again and again. Where helps himself refers, as I said earlier on, to a care of self that should not be confused with an aestheticizing position. Helps him, the critic, reader critic who helps himself again and again uses literature as a resource. As usual, you'll find in the last slide the works cited. There is the works that I drew on to deliver the lecture, and you'll receive the PowerPoints at the end of today's tutorial. I will send them both to Professor Rashni Singh. So thank you for your attention. I think I can stop sharing and we can certainly move to the tutorial.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you for your insightful lecture. And there I can see there is one question in the chat box. So would
Yes,
you like to take this up at this point or during the tutorial?
absolutely. Let me open the chat box.
Sure, ma'am.
Okay.
Sure.
Yes, I would love to take this question. Thank you. We know that it's from Indu Kumari. We know that you explained this already, but just to get a better clarity, can you please explain how the idea of modernity is different for Arendt? Yes, great question. Great question. I understood she's developing it from the relational world, but where does she situate her understanding different? Great question, point of clarification. So, in fact, we should distinguish between Arendt's ideal modernity and the meaningful world, because the meaningful world evolves as a web of relations. Her relational understanding of the world evolves from a criticism of modernity as traditionally understood. How do people traditionally understand modernity? We tend to associate it to progress. Modernity means automatically progress. Arendt says no. Modernity does not just mean progress. There are within progress also archaic forces that pull us back. So we cannot exactly imagine modernity just as a linear progress, an arrow whereby we move forward. Because there are forces that pull us back to a condition that seems anachronistic in modernity. The condition of people who are reduced to bodies, to animal laborants, to the biological life. The fact that we need to take care of biological life, the burden of having to support biological life, to keep it alive. That is not exactly modern. We have not emancipated ourselves from what Raquel van Hagen called the spell of newer happening, from the fact that we are just bodies. So if we imagine modernity as emancipation, as a progress in the human condition, well, we also need to remember that within this progress, there are forces, archaic forces at work that haunt the human condition and continue to cause injustices, in fact, because the divisions between groups of people, okay, there is injustice. You're welcome. I will, Suman, I will respond. I'm just trying to finish my comment so as to be as clear as possible. Arendt, it's as if, as Arendt was saying, when looking at our world, look, the injustices that we have are at risk of being perpetuated if we do not, first of all, explore what we mean by modernity and the kind of modernity we want, a modernity that does not leave anyone behind. And for Arendt, that amounts to what Rahel thought, exiting, not being haunted by being just a body, and so being just an outcast, amounting to no value because you're just a body and you're not part of a society. I don't know if this is so the world, finding a shelter in the world. When she imagines the world as a relational space, it is a kind of a reparative idea of these haunting forces. The world as a relational space is a world that includes everyone, where we feel we exist because we are seen and heard by others. We're not just mute spell, we're not just naked life, we're not just bodies. True modernity is that relational world for Arendt. I mean, I'm reducing Arendt again with great humility, but I hope I responded to Indu. Is this clear, Indu? Clearer? Okay, thank you. Sumana, regarding the last lecture, yes, I'm curious to know how you differentiate between the two approaches. Yes, that's also a very good question because it allows me to clarify. Yes, of Sontag and Sedgwick, or rather as a conjoint approach to make a critical study of literature. Exactly. Considering Sontag and considering Sedgwick, what do they say? What do they contribute to our study of literature? What can we glean from them? What can we gain and from them that we can apply to our reading of texts? Okay, so I begin to respond. Sontag, attention to not reusing the text to a message. So remember, we talked about Benjamin's rejection of thematic reading. Sontag is saying the same. So not reducing the text to a theme, to the illustration of a theme, not using the text as, that is, giving ourselves the right of not using the text as a documentary that illustrates a social problem. So therefore, a text can be a feminist text, not just when it denounces patriarchy. We can find feminism in texts that we would not suspect of dealing with feminism. For example, just to give you a very blatant example, Ulysses by Joyce. Okay, we can find way to read that text from a feminist lens. How? By paying attention to its form, to the language, not just to the message. Okay, well, the message is that Leopold Bloom is you're a very, very standard white Irish guy. Okay, he's an ogler, among other things. So the message would would condemn Bloom, but paying attention to form, to the nuances, to the crafting of the text allows for a feminist readings. In fact, feminist readings have been performed. Hélène Cixous is the place I would go. She performs a feminist reading of Joyce, among other authors. So Sontag not reducing the critical act to an extraction of the meaning, the message. So establishing a relation with the text, the tete-a-tete. Establishing a relation with the text, which means the risk, and this is, it takes courage to do that, to value the private moments with the text and to find a way to vehicle those private moments into public discourse. Because when the reader rises as a critic, he or she steps into public discourse. And so the idea that the text is, and now I turn to Sedgwick, not just a cultural object existing on a plane of other cultural objects, it's a cultural object existing in a society that some of us feel as hostile. Queer subjects, women, racialized, ethnic subjects may experience society, their environment is hostile. So Sedgwick is encouraging, building on the legacy of. I'm not saying that there is a necessarily direct, link, because there isn't. But these two women are two poles of a stretch of time where criticism evolved more and more toward a more complex relation with a desire to think with literature and to use literature for the well-being of the self. So Sedgwick would say, okay, the idea of using the text, thinking with the text to repair the hostile forces coming from the environment. Now, if you open any text, let me just mention perhaps a legendary text, a text that has been as influential as Sontag and Sedgwick. This bridge called My Back, edited by Gloria Ansaldúa and someone else. It's been re-edited. There, the authors theorize exactly this view, the Sedgwick view of literature. That is, literature having to do with an act of repairing hostile forces. So there's a strong argument for the uses of literature. What do we do? What happens concretely? If you open this bridge called My Back, okay, you find a lot of feminist adversarial discourse, but you also find attention, an encouragement to be attentive to features, elements, details in a text that would otherwise escape other readers and trust your kind of attention. So it's an invitation, the Sedgwick reparative line, I take it to be an invitation to really care for the individual moments of the text and find a way to externalize those individuals, to trust that individual one-on-one tete-a-tete relation with the text, because the text plays an important role in healing our social wounds. So care, how does it change critical study? Well, first of all, I suggest it undermines positively, though, the idea that literature is a canon, a chronological canon, or a national canon, because the reader critic here, the thinker, knower, seeker, all right, may feel entitled to turn to texts that are distant in time, distant in geographies. So there is a more planetary dimension to the act of criticism. as for Sontag, this emphasis on the formal uh, uh, aspect, on the material, the material aspect, is due to the fact that Sontag thinks of the critic as someone attuned to the sensibility. She speaks of sensibility. We would speak of climate or paradigms, the sensibility of her time. So the critic is profoundly historical here, and should be attuned to the vibes of our time, to the needs to the exigency, to the desires of our time. This is illustrated, I think, concretely by the beginning of Notes on Count. So if you like Sumana and the others, I could share the slide that I could not share, containing the beginning of Notes on Camp, where you encounter an embodiment of the critic as Sontag theorized her or him. Would you like that? Can I do that?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, then let me go back. Uh, okay, let me share. Go back and share the PowerPoint. So to the right slide, possibly. I'm tracking the slide. Let me see. No, it's okay. All right, here we go. Okay, share. And now, if I'm lucky, I should be able to show you the slide. Here we go. Probably you're seeing the slide, right? You are, right? Atolanto, can you see the slide?
Definitely, ma'am. We can see.
Thank you. So the task of the critic as described in Notes on Count. Allow me to read the beginning, okay, of Notes on Count, 1964. It's With Against Interpretation, the essay that gave Sontag instant celebrity, because she was saying something that made sense to a lot of people. Many things in the world have not been named, and many things, even if they have been named, have never been described. One of these is the sensibility, unmistakably modern, a variant of sophistication, but hardly identical with it, that goes by the cult name of camp. For myself, I plead the goal of self-edification and the goal of a sharp conflict in my own sensibility. I'm strongly drawn to camp and almost as strongly offended by it. That is why I want to talk about it and why I can. So what you're hearing here is a critic who practices critical theory, not just criticism, wants to sense the climate of the time and fit, so to speak, the reading of texts and cultural objects within the climate of the time. And the climate, as described here eloquently, is that the good critic is someone who is at the same time attracted and repelled by something, who can stand objectively, step back. We were talking about objectivity. Step back and talk about texts or cultural objects that at the same time attract and repel it. Now, I will stop here. I saw in the chat we have to stop because we can resume. I for a minute I had forgotten that we have the tutorial later on. So uh, I am
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. We can continue this in the tutorial session
absolutely
after post lunch. So
yes.
we will, yeah. So we will close the session now, and we will join at due time for the
Yeah.
tutorial.